Hello and welcome. I'm Sam Califer, your host for Vision, the show where we talk all about the College of Arts and Sciences and its faculty and students. Today I'm joined by Dr. Molly Zuckerman, a professor in the Department of Anthropology and Middle Eastern Cultures. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. I love getting to talk to anthropologists. Y'all kind of do so much cool research. And yeah, anthropology is something that everyone thinks about doing growing up. You know, Indiana Jones was on for people my age. And so I love to hear, you know, what brought you to anthropology and why anthropology over a different field of study.
Sure, and that's something that I hear from my students all the time. So when I teach classes on anthropology, most of the students, they know about archaeology and they're really interested in archaeology. And it might be the thing that they know about within anthropology. It was much the same for me. So I think that my mother, if she had been born in a different era, would have ended up as an anthropologist.
Sure.
But she wasn't, and so she had me. And I was the one who was set up from a pretty early age, being provided with books and being shown films and movies and stuff like that, that made me just get really interested in it. I did not plan on a career in anthropology from high school onwards. It was only after being a biological sciences major, an undecided major, an English major, et cetera, that I found anthropology as something that I had been fascinated by as a child, and it was an opportunity for me to get to study it in college, and I was hooked.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you said you studied so many different things before, because I think that it kind of defines anthropology in a lot of ways. It is kind of bringing all of those different studies together.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, so cool, and I'm glad you made it to anthropology, archaeology, and all of your cool skills that you bring here to Mississippi State. And yeah, your research is so interesting, kind of talking about multidisciplinary. You often are looking at diseases of the past, but through biology and anthropology. So you're looking into the specifics of the disease, but then the research also will take a step back and look into those broader societal considerations.
Absolutely.
So that's just so interesting. I'd love to hear you talk about that more. And what do you think that dual approach does for the work?
Sure, thank you. So it actually relates to a class that I'm teaching right now called Plagues and People, which is for both undergraduate and graduate students across a variety of majors and disciplines. And it is all about the relationship between human societies and infectious disease throughout history. And the reason we study this topic is because infectious diseases don't just influence human societies influence human diseases. And while a couple of years ago that concept might have been a little bit of a stretch for some of us, the COVID pandemic made it very concrete and very recent in our experiences. We could see who you were in society, what you did for a living, where you lived, for example, the access to healthcare that you had and things like that really influenced your experience of the disease, how much it impacted your life, your family's life, in addition to, and sometimes on top of, whether you got sick from it or died from it, right? And that's true in the past too. So one of the great things about anthropology is that it allows us to look very, very deeply into the past. And when we do that and consider all of the context around diseases and health, like things like society and culture and population size, things like that, the politics of a particular time, the economy, we can look at how all of these different causes influenced how disease worked in the past, and by identifying those really deep causes and patterns through history, see what has been carried through to the present, and identify the really deep drivers of how infectious diseases are impacting modern day society, and vice versa.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's so many trends from the past to look into, and then it helps you kind of understand when something like COVID happens. Kind of getting ready for this interview, you know, I'm thinking about like diseases from the past and the way they affect society. And the thing that really came to my mind was leprosy, because I think that's a good example. Like, they were shunned from society.
Absolutely.
They were moved out, the leprosy colonies. And so it was a very obvious societal component to the disease. And I think that's something people don't think about. So.
Absolutely. We were actually talking about exactly that in class. A person volunteered leprosy or Hansen's disease as one of those diseases that that you have to think about people's experiences of it in the past, but also in the present, as how it affects the body, but how also the suffering that it brings with it because of how much of a negative association or stigma is added onto the disease. So just the levels of like psychological and social suffering that goes along with something that otherwise is just a bacterium infecting your body.
Right, yeah, it's just like any other bacteria, but there's so many connotations and societal implications and emotions that are connected with it. So.
And we have to understand all of that to really get a handle on how contemporary disease is happening and also be able to predict some things about the future.
Sure, yeah. Okay, and so you recently co-authored a book, you have it right here, Emerging Infections, Transitions from, what is the name?
Emerging Infections, 3 epidemiologic transitions from prehistory to the present.
Nice, yeah, so is doing similar work. You're looking at 3 maybe examples and charting what happened throughout time. So I'd love to hear about the book and what you hope it accomplishes.
Sure, thank you. So I was invited to work on this book because my PhD advisor, George Amelagos, was one of the original authors. He passed away shortly after I finished graduate school, and the other authors on the book are also his former students. And when it was time to reissue the book, the other authors wanted to have the same perspective that George brought to it. And what George did was looking at the history of infectious disease and interactions between disease and society. So it was a great honor to be asked. I miss my advisor every day. He was one of my great teachers. I loved him. And so getting to work on the book was like getting to step into his footsteps a little bit. Like when we were working on the manuscript, you could still see his comments in the margin. And it just really made me happy. So that mix of the personal and professional. But I was very excited about this book because it wasn't just designed for academic audiences, but it was also designed for the public. So for example, it came out in paperback, right? And it's available widely at booksellers. And the neat thing about this is the reissue was kind of prompted by the COVID pandemic because the ideas that are embedded in this encourage us to think about the history of human health as having gone through some big transitions throughout times, hence the name. So the development of agriculture and our shift from being hunter-gatherers to living in farming societies that happened about 10,000 years ago ushered in a lot of people, in particular children, dying of infectious diseases like smallpox and cholera. And then as industrialization happened and people concentrated and began living in cities in very, very high numbers and in great density, we have a huge increase in the number of deaths from infectious disease. Then there were public health advances, so things like treating water, treating sewage, making sure that food quality is high, that people have good places to live, and that dropped deaths from infectious disease. And then medical advances like vaccination came in and kind of put a real cap on deaths from infectious disease, and people transitioned into living longer, not dying as children, and instead dying of chronic and degenerative diseases, which are the major killers across societies today. But then we have our third transition, which is how COVID fits in. So starting in the 1980s with increased global connections between societies and economies, or globalization, we had a real rise in new infectious diseases and the ones that used to be controlled by vaccination, things like measles, and right now pertussis or whooping cough. These are really, really common. And COVID and other infectious diseases that have recently appeared, like HIV and like SARS and MERS, or Middle Eastern Respiratory Virus, and all of the avian influenzas, they fit right into this as things that are increasing in how many people they sicken and kill all over the world.
Yeah, thinking about the different types of sicknesses, people. So like cancer is the thing that's killing. And it's, if you live long enough, eventually that'll happen. But
that's exactly it.
But that was not even an issue.
No,
you know,
most people died young.
For so much of human society. So and so that's kind of what you're looking into. It's fascinating. So cool. Okay, and we've only got a couple more minutes, but I wanted to have you on because you were also recently quoted in an article by Science. They wanted an expert statement from you about someone else's research into syphilis. So just for someone who doesn't do research, what is the the rationale of that?
Sure.
And then what did it mean for you to be asked?
Sure. So that recent work ties into understanding how long the sexually transmitted infection syphilis has been around and where it came from, which is something that people have been debating for about 500 years. And it's the big question, did Columbus bring it back to Europe from the Americas, or was it already present in Europe, right? So people have been debating this from many, many different fields and disciplines for hundreds of years. And while we can partially answer that question using the skeletons of deceased human individuals who lived in the past, as well as historical records, a lot of information from that to kind of fully answer that question has to come from genetic information, so ancient DNA. So this is a group of researchers who were using ancient DNA from people who lived in the Americas in the past to really answer the question of exactly when did syphilis start, when did it evolve, and then how did it spread from there. And the reason that I was asked to chime in on that is because I have devoted a lot of my research career to understanding how that disease acts. And part of the really wonderful thing about science is that rather than one group of scientists saying, here we have found a truth, right? The truth in science, where one asks other people with expertise to weigh in and independently evaluate that. So I was able to read the study before it was published, for example, and all of the additional materials and weigh in. And I was just deeply impressed and excited by the quality of that really answered the question, where did syphilis come from? And it turns out that we have a very, very deep history of what began the disease, its kind of precursor or its ancestor in the Americas, and then it was brought back to Europe by likely Columbus and other European explorers.
Wow.
So it answers a question that people have been getting at for 500 years. And I mean, all of us learned about that question, maybe not the details of syphilis, in our K through 12 education, like the voyages of Columbus and what happened afterwards. Well, he brought back what turned into syphilis.
Yeah, and to have that definitive answer through some, hard evidence is so interesting. And yeah, I think what you were talking about is something important to highlight. It's like you don't work in a vacuum.
No.
Science is a community. Just hearing you talk about how y'all wrote this book in honor, it's your lives, it's so personal, and there's other people who do the research, and so you communicate and all work together to try to find those important answers.
To make sure that it's accurate.
Yeah, which is important.
Yeah.
You've done, maybe there was something that they looked over that you could have seen, and so that the answers are as accurate as we can get them.
All those perspectives and voices coming together to make sure this is as accurate as possible. And in things like this, that we tell the story of what happened in the past and how it can be used by us to help understand the present and the future as accurately and as interestingly as possible.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Super cool to hear about all your work. And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Vision. We'll see you next time.